Welcome back to the AR-15 barrel series. Today, we'll be looking at several different barrels from Bad Attitude Department that were sent in by DayDream Defense for evaluation. So, thank you very much to DayDream Defense for providing me with the barrels and ammunition for this review. Unfortunately, things didn't quite go as planned, and we ended up with some unexpected results. But I learned a few things along the way, and I think the results were pretty interesting. First, we'll go over the specs. Then, look at things a little more closely during an inspection, and we'll round things out by seeing how these barrels perform at the range. The barrels are 16 inches, button rifled with a 5.56 NATO chamber, 1-7 twist, and are made from nitride-treated 416R stainless steel. So, nothing too out of the ordinary with the specs on these barrels. Although nitride-treated 416 stainless is a slightly less common combination to have, but there are several other barrels out there that do that. Also, the exterior surface on these barrels are bead blasted before being nitrated, which gives them a less reflective surface, and I haven't really seen that on too many other barrels. The gas block journals are dimpled for the gas block set screw, which is something that I prefer to see, mainly because it helps with gas block alignment. One other thing that I noticed about the barrels is that a few of the gas ports have some burrs on the outside, which isn't a huge deal, but did make installing and removing the gas blocks a bit more challenging. Next up, we'll take a closer look at things during the inspection. Starting off with the throat erosion gauge, all the barrels are at about a 1 on this gauge, which is what I would expect from new barrels, so no surprises here. Next, we have a chamber and throat dimensions gauge. This checks to make sure that the chamber and throat are to at least minimum size, which is important for reliable functioning and ammunition compatibility. And all barrels pass this gauge. Moving on to headspace, and starting with the minimum headspace gauge, all 4 barrels pass this gauge, which is good. So we'll move on to a mid-range headspace gauge. And all 4 barrels fail the mid-range gauge, which isn't necessarily unexpected. This just means that the headspace is not on the tighter side. So we'll move on to a headspace end-range gauge. This is a 1.4696 inch headspace gauge, which is getting pretty close to the max headspace. And 1 barrel passes, but 3 barrels failed. So that's not so good. And last, here's the maximum headspace gauge. And all 3 barrels pass this gauge. So these barrels are still technically within the serviceable headspace range, but much closer to the max end of the headspace range than what I would prefer to see out of new barrels. And here's a quick look at the chart of barrels that I've inspected so far, and these barrels definitely have headspace on the looser side. I gauged 3 of the gas ports at 76 thousandths, and 1 of the barrels was at 77 thousandths. So the gas port size is about average, or slightly above average compared to the other 16-inch mid-length barrels that I've gauged so far. The barrel extensions varied a bit between the 4 different examples, and compared to the other barrels that I measured, these were around average to a bit smaller than average, which will make installation easier, but will make for a bit looser fit with the upper receiver. There was also a bit of variation with the gas block journal diameter, but they were generally larger than average, which will help to ensure a good gas seal with the gas block. Next up, I'll use my test-long Borescope to take a look at the inside. All 4 barrels look pretty similar to one another, so we won't be going over every detail of every barrel, but I'll try to give you guys a good representation of what these barrels look like. Starting with the body of the chamber, you can see that there is some pretty severe pitting at the beginning, but it gets less severe as we go deeper into the barrel. We'll go over the cause of that pitting a little bit later, but for now, just know that that isn't normal and that's not supposed to be there. Moving on to the throat, you can see some roughness or smearing on the right side of the rifling lands. This isn't too uncommon to see in mid or lower tier AR barrels, but the smearing on these barrels look to be a little bit worse than average. Looking at the evenness of the throat cut, that doesn't look too bad. The rifling looks to start in fairly consistent places on these barrels. Moving on to the rifling, things look pretty good. I didn't see any severe defects in the rifling, and it looks pretty clean for an AR barrel. There were a few slight tool marks here and there, but that's not too uncommon to see in barrels around this price range. In general, everything looked fine, and I don't have any concerns about the rifling. Moving on to the gas ports, all 4 of these look pretty rough, with some pretty gnarly burrs. The burrs should break off pretty quickly as the barrel gets shot, so, in my opinion, the gas ports having burrs isn't a huge deal, but they do look pretty ugly. The only real concern that I would have is if a burr got dragged against the rifling as it's shot out of the bore, which might cause a scratch or a gouge. And last, here's a look at the crowns. As you can see, the crown and the last little bit of rifling has the same pitting that we saw at the beginning of the chamber, and this pitting is present on all 4 of the barrels that I had. When I first saw this pitting, I thought that it might have been due to something wrong with the nitrite treatment, but I contacted Bad Attitude Department and asked them about it. They looked into it and determined that the barrels weren't plugged before being media blasted. So the inside of the bore got sandblasted as well. And that's what caused all the pitting. Looking at the exterior surfaces of the barrels, you can see that it has the same texture to it, so I suppose that solves that mystery. Before contacting Bad Attitude Department about the pitting, I bought a 12.5-inch barrel in an effort to hopefully get a good example to test, but that barrel ended up having the same pitting, so that didn't work out. But once I told Bad Attitude Department about the issues that I had, they refunded the purchase to DayDream Defense for the 16-inch barrels and refunded me for the 12.5-inch barrel that I had purchased. They also immediately removed the rest of the barrels from their website because I assumed this wasn't an isolated incident. So unfortunately, we don't have any good barrels to compare to, and since all these barrels were defective, I only ended up shooting 2 of the 16-inch barrels and then one group with the 12.5-inch barrel. But we ended up with some pretty interesting results. Speaking of that, we'll go over the shooting setup and then head to the range. Bad Attitude Department does not advise a barrel break-in procedure, so no barrel break-in was performed. The barrels were fitted into upper receivers that had previously been supplied to the channel by Bad Attitude Department. I also used a bulk carrier group from Classified Defense and BCM MCMR 13-inch handguards. To increase rifle stability, the handguards were fitted with a 3-inch front bag rider, and the stock was supported by a rear bag. The SBR lower uses an A5 buffer system with an A5-2 buffer, Sprinco green spring, and a trigger provided by AR Gold. Barrel 1 uses a scope provided by Vector Optics. It's their Continental 6-36 by 56mm first focal plane PRS rifle scope, which features a 34mm main tube, HT shot lenses, and high definition glass, which provides 90% light transmission. Barrel 3 used a D&T The One 7-35 by 56mm scope that was provided by D&T Optics. A Garmin 0C1 Pro chronograph was used to collect velocity data. A Mantis X10 Elite, as well as a Shooter's Global SG Pulse unit were mounted to the rifles to keep track of rifle stability and detect any possible shooter-induced flyers. Groups were measured using the Ballistic X app. Each group is 30 shots, fired consecutively over about 4 minutes. This simulates a match or practical type scenario where the barrel will get some heat into it and also gives us a decent sample size to work with. Between each group, I used a chamber chiller and leaf blower for cooldown. Distance was 100 yards. Point of aim was a small circle at the bottom of the target. Point of impact was set a few inches higher to preserve the aiming point. Wind was monitored with a ribbon, and each 30-shot group took about 4 minutes to shoot and was edited down to about 15 seconds. DayDream Defense paid for 3 types of ammunition for this evaluation. First, we'll start with IMI Razor Core 77 grain. Next will be Winchester M193, and last will be Federal Gold Medal 77 grain Sierra Match Kings. All right, let's do it. All right, first group here will be with IMI 77 grain Razor Core. This stuff usually groups okay. It doesn't typically produce the tightest groups, but it's not too bad, and the velocities are usually pretty solid. Anyway, the groups out of these 2 barrels end up being pretty interesting. Again, the crown and a bit of rifling before the crown were media blasted, so that probably had a negative effect on the groups. Shooting felt fine on my end, meaning that I felt like I shot to my normal shooting potential, and I didn't feel like I pulled any of the shots. The weather was a bit warm on this day, and combined with the direct sunlight, I ended up having a few camera issues during this range trip. The over-the-shoulder cam did make it to the end of this group. Anyway, the groups ended up looking a bit odd, so we will finish up the groups and then take a closer look. Alright, we'll get started by looking at the velocity numbers. This is all of my velocity data for the IMI Razor Core, as sorted by barrel length. And on this chart, you can see the specs and the round counts for all the barrels, as well as the temperature at the time of the test, and lot numbers, as well as a few other things. And here's a graph that makes things a little bit easier to look at. These are the velocities that are recorded out of 16-inch barrels with the IMI, and the Bad Attitude barrels are pretty fast, with velocities of 2,724 feet per second and 2,721 feet per second. Also pretty consistent between the 2 barrels. So a little slower than the Criterion, but still pretty fast barrels. And here's another graph that shows all the standard deviations that are recorded for my groups out with the IMI, which range from a low of 14 feet per second to a high of 27 feet per second. And the 2 Bad Attitude Department barrels were basically with most of the rest of the barrels with SDs of 20 feet per second and 23 feet per second. Looking at the individual shot data, nothing seems significantly out of place. And then looking at the rifle stability data, both ended up with rifle stability scores of 99.6, which is about what I normally shoot. So, as far as I can tell, I shot these barrels about as well as I shot any other group. Looking at the two groups, things look a bit odd. Barrel 1 had a very interesting cold bore shot that landed way over to the left. The rifle stability data looked fine on that shot, and it also felt fine to me when I broke the shot, so I'm just going to blame that one on the pitting near the crown. And then looking at the group for barrel 3, obviously quite a bit of lateral stringing. The group is only about 2 inches high, which isn't bad, but the group is about 4.5 inches wide, which isn't so great. And then looking at a replay of this group as it's being shot, it mostly starts out towards the left and then starts moving towards the right. So, pretty weird. I suppose this might be due to the pitting being more severe on one side versus the other, or something like that, but I'm not too sure. So, you can let me know your thoughts in the comments. Before going over the group numbers, I'll briefly explain my AZ score, which is how I like to evaluate groups. AZ stands for A-zone equivalence distance, and it's based on the mean radius, which is the average distance that each shot is from the center of the group. This makes the AZ score more resistant to one flyer wrecking the group. I then multiply the mean radius by 4, and then calculate the maximum distance where that group size would still fit into a USPSA A-zone. To me, this just puts things in an easier to understand context so that I can have a better grasp on the practical implications of the group. Anyway, for barrel 1, a 30-shot group size ended up at 4.482 MOA, with a mean radius of 0.875 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 161 yards. Barrel 3 ended up with fairly similar numbers, with a 30-shot group size of 4.299 MOA, with a mean radius of 1.079 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 131 yards. And if you want some more familiar numbers to look at, we take the 30-shot group and break it down into 3 10-shot groups. Barrel 1 got better the more I shot it, with shots 1 to 10 forming a 4.2 MOA group, and then shots 11 to 20 formed a 2.3 MOA group, and shots 21 to 30 gave us a 1.6 MOA group, for an average 10-shot group size at 2.7 MOA. And barrel 3 also got better the more I shot it, starting with a 3.0 MOA group, then 2.7 MOA, and ending at 2.0 MOA, which gives us an average 10-shot group size of 2.6 MOA. Here is the leaderboard chart for all the groups I shot with the IMI Razor Core. This chart includes all the data, like the barrel specs, lot numbers, mean radius, and extreme spread. And here's a look at the graph with just the AZ numbers, which is how I like to look at things. Obviously, these barrels aren't exactly prime examples, but I can only shoot the barrels that I have access to. Also, I'm not a robot, meaning that I'm not a perfect shooter, so I'm sure that all these groups could be at least a little bit better, but I do the best that I can. Anyway, out of the 23 groups on this leaderboard, the Bad Attitude Department Chimera 16-inch barrels came in 20th and 22nd place. So not the worst, but pretty far down the line. Considering what the crowns look like, this isn't the worst that could have happened, but we have Winchester M193 up next, and things got pretty wild. So let's take a look at that. Alright, so here are the barrels with Winchester M193, and things go quite poorly. You'll notice that I'm zooming way out on both targets. That's because both barrels had several shots that missed the entire target. So I ended up calling a mercy rule and stopping both groups early. Barrel 1 ended up with 8 shots on target out of the 10 shots fired, and barrel 3 ended up with 6 shots on target out of 13 shots fired, plus 1 hit the target stand. But I didn't notice that one until later. So this was quite shocking and also pretty entertaining. I really wanted to see how bad these groups could be, so I ended up shooting another group with barrel 3 at 50 yards to see if the result would be any different. So let's take a look at that. Alright, so a bit of a different shooting setup with this one, and not quite as comfortable as my normal shooting setup, but I'm shooting horrible ammo through a known defective barrel, so I think we'll still be okay. All the shots ended up on the cardboard this time, but just barely. The Garmin missed quite a few shots with this group. I'm not sure if that was due to the dust being kicked up, or being closer to the backstop, but that happened. Shooting on my end wasn't the best, if I'm honest, but still plenty good enough for shooting a group at 50 yards with a 35 power scope. There were no malfunctions, wind was fine, and ejection was just a little bit forward. So we will finish up the group and then take a closer look. Alright, here's a peek at the velocity chart for Winchester M193, and if we narrow this down to just 16-inch barrels, the Bad Attitude Department barrel was still pretty fast. The first group was the fastest at 3,145 feet per second, and then the second group at 50 yards was just a little bit slower at 3,128 feet per second. Looking at the velocity standard deviation, it was on the higher side at 33 feet per second and 34 feet per second. Looking at the individual data, you can see that the Garmin dropped quite a few shots for the velocity. Rifle stability average was 99.2, which is quite a bit lower than what I would like to see, but I wasn't taking this group too seriously, and that may have opened it up an extra half an inch at worst. So I think we'll still be okay. Looking at the group, things obviously look quite erratic, and to be honest, I had no idea that this bad of a group was possible with bullets not flying sideways. I figured in order for a group to be this bad, the bullets would have to be tumbling or something. But this is what I got. If you've followed my series for any time at all, you've likely seen me struggle quite a bit with Winchester M193, and my theory is that the jackets are really thin, and that combined with the rough and pitted surface at the end of this barrel damaged the jackets and resulted in this abomination of a group. But you can let me know your theories in the comments below. 30-shot group size came in at 25.5 MOA, with a mean radius of 7 MOA, and an absolutely hilarious AZ score of just 19 yards. Breaking things down into 10-shot groups doesn't look much better, with an average 10-shot group size of 21.8 MOA. And here's a look at my leaderboard chart for Winchester M193, and here's a look at the graph, and this barrel is the worst of the worst, coming in last place, beating out some other impressively poor groups. So I thought this was a pretty interesting result. Next up, we'll see how things go with Federal Gold Medal. Alright, last group of these barrels is with Federal Gold Medal 77 grain series Match Kings, and unfortunately I had a few camera failures. This was filmed in August, and it was a pretty warm day. The cameras didn't really get much of a break, and had been basically running for an hour straight at this point, combined with sitting in the direct sunlight, so it's not too surprising that they overheated. Anyway, other than the technical issues, everything else with the groups went fine. Shooting felt good on my end with both barrels, no malfunctions, wind was calm, the Garmin got velocities from every shot, and the Mantis missed a couple. So we will finish up and then take a look. Alright, here's all my velocity data for Federal Gold Medal 77 grain series Match Kings, with all the extra details for those of you who are interested. And here are things narrowed down to just 16-inch barrels. And again, the barrels from Bad Attitude Department are running pretty fast, and also pretty consistent between the two barrels. Barrel 1 had an average velocity of 2,573 feet per second, and Barrel 2 was just 1 foot per second faster at 2574. Looking at the velocity SDs, both barrels were on the lower end of what I've seen from Federal, with Barrel 1 having an SD of 14 feet per second, and Barrel 3 doing a little bit better at 15 feet per second. Looking at the individual shot data, it looked like Barrel 1 slowed down a bit for the last 8 shots or so, which is a little strange I guess, but nothing too extreme. Both average rifle stability scores looked fine at 99.6 and 99.7. Looking at the groups, these are definitely the most normal looking groups of the day. No extreme stringing, and the groups don't look too horrible, all things considered. For Barrel 1, 30-shot group size came in at 2.430 MOA, with a mean radius of 0.645 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 219 yards. Barrel 3 did a bit worse, with a 30-shot group size of 2.976 MOA, and a mean radius of 0.753 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 187 yards. Here's a look at the leaderboard chart for Federal Gold Medal, and moving on to the graph, we can see that these barrels struggled quite a bit. Out of the 24 groups on this leaderboard, Barrel 1 came in 21st place, and Barrel 3 came in last. Not too surprising considering how the crowns looked, but at least these groups were a lot better than the Winchester. Next up, we're going to switch to the 12.5-inch barrel. Again, I bought this barrel with my own money in an attempt to get a good sample to test, but unfortunately, it had the same pitting at both ends of the barrel. So that didn't go the way I wanted it to, and Bad Attitude Department ended up refunding me for the barrel. But I did shoot it with some AAC 77 grain OTM just to see how that would go. And as a side note, for those of you who don't know, AAC is currently shutting down operations due to a powder supply shortage. Anyway, let's see how this 12.5 barrel does. I built the 12.5 with an upper from Bad Attitude Department, a BCM bolt, Expo Arms 10.5-inch rail, and the scope I'll be using is the Eagle Blaze 7-35x56, which was provided by CV Life. The scope features multi-coated Japanese ED glass, an illuminated reticle, locking turrets, and a 34mm main tube. Alright, here's the 12.5-inch barrel shooting AAC 77 grain. The barrel has a mid-length gas system, and it felt pretty good for a 12.5. I used a pin gauge to measure the gas port at 76 thousandths, so that seems like a pretty good size, I guess. Ejection looked nice and consistent at about 3:30 or 4 o'clock. Shooting felt fine on my end with this group, and the wind was pretty calm. I ended up filming this in October, so the weather was a bit cooler, which helped with the cameras to not overheat, so that was nice. Both the Mantis and Garmin captured data for every shot, so we will finish up and then take a closer look. Alright, average muzzle velocity out of the 12.5 was 2,372 feet per second with an SD of 27 feet per second. Shot 12 was particularly slow at 87 feet per second slower than average, and other than that, nothing with the velocity numbers looked out of place. Average rifle stability was 99.7, which is fine with me, and again, the group looks pretty interesting. The first 6 shots landed pretty high, and then the rest of the group shifted down about 2 inches or so, which is pretty strange. I suppose those first couple shots may have knocked down some high spots from where the bore had been media blasted, or something like that. After those first 6 shots, the rest of the group was about 2 inches tall and 2 inches wide, but looking at all 30 shots, the group ended up being about 4 inches tall, so a bit strange. But I suppose that's what you get with a sandblasted barrel. A 30-shot group size ended up at 3.878 MOA, with a mean radius of 0.999 MOA, giving us an AZ score of 141 yards. And breaking things down into 10-shot groups, the average 10-shot group size was 2.2 MOA. Alright, so again, a thank you to DayDream Defense for sponsoring the video and funding this evaluation. Unfortunately, things didn't exactly go as planned, but I think this is a learning experience for all of us. Make sure you're subscribed, because I have a lot more material on the way. I'll see you next time. Later.